Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Legends of the Jedi. In our last episode, we concluded the Tales of the Jedi series. In the end, Qel-Droma found redemption and became one with the Force. We also said our final goodbyes to Nomi, Vima, Silvar, Thawne, Tot Danita, and many of the wonderful characters we've come to know and love. Speaking of our last episode, one thing I did forget to mention is that I set up an Instagram page for the podcast. So, if you're inclined, please follow me on Instagram. The name is the same as the podcast, Legends of the Jedi, but there's an underscore between each word. I try to update it a few times a week with Old Republic facts, spotlights, art, and other content. In fact, you'll even see that many of the things we talk about in today's episode have already been featured on my Instagram page. In today's episode, and before we move on to our next story, we're going to go back and fill in some of the gaps. All the things we are talking about today are directly related to the Tales of the Jedi storyline, but they came after the fact as authors and contributors continued to expand on the mythology we covered in the first 14 episodes. Much of the information conveyed in this episode comes from Wikipedia, as well as other source books. I used the Tales of the Jedi Companion from West End Games, the New Essential Chronology, the Knights of the Old Republic Campaign Guide, and a couple other sources that I mentioned throughout. So without further ado, hop into your pod racers, check your ignition gauges, and let's race right into it. Our first topic today is the Stygian Caldera. Some of you may already know that a caldera is the cauldron-like hollow that forms in volcanoes. You know the whole circular part containing all the magma? Well, that's a caldera. Well, in Star Wars, the Stygian Caldera refers to a large nebula that surrounds the Sith Empire region of the galaxy. Wikipedia describes it as a nebulosity. It acted as a hyperspatial breakwater or veil that made it difficult to navigate both into and out of that area. The caldera was situated within the Esstran sector of the Star Wars galaxy. It was first depicted in the Essential Atlas, a 2009 reference book authored by Jason Fry and Daniel Wallace. So, we have Sith space, and it contains a bunch of worlds that we've seen like Ziost, Korriban, Cardelba, Dromund Kaas, Thule, and so on. These worlds all fall within the caldera. This explains why the Sith Empire remained relatively undetected in the 2,000 years before the Great Hyperspace War. If you remember, the Great Hyperspace War takes place 5,000 BBY, or before the Battle of Yavin. It's worth knowing that it was easier to pass into the caldera from the outside than the other way around. So, this resulted in a variety of different species and spacefaring races finding themselves stuck in Sith space. Two of the examples we're given are humans from the Tapani sector, and other various aliens like the Houk, which are a race of big, bulky humanoids. Like these guys could be the club bouncers of the Star Wars universe. If you need a better visual depiction of them, it's probably easier to search online. It's spelled Houk. As we'll later see, these races, and other races that found themselves in the caldera, were later integrated into Sith society, typically as slaves, but not always. So when Gav and Jory Darrigan show up on Korriban in 5000 BBY, I believe this was in episode 2 of the podcast, it was kind of a big deal. Their Navicomputer had the coordinates that provided the Sith with a clear and reliable route out of the caldera. Nagasato used this knowledge as an opportunity to launch a full-scale invasion of the Republic, what we now know as the Great Hyperspace War. Here we have a quote from a short story entitled Lost Tribe of the Sith, Paragon, by John Jackson Miller. Sato was a visionary. He knew permanent isolation was a practical impossibility in an empire comprising so many systems and so many potential hyperspace routes. The Stygian Caldera was a veil, not a wall, and he could see opportunity through it. The route out of the caldera later became known as the Darrigan Trail. In the aftermath of the war, Supreme Chancellor Pultimo, that's the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic at the time, ordered a counter-invasion of Sith space. If you remember, that's why we don't see any of the Sith species in the later Tales of the Jedi stories, because the Republic effectively wiped them out, with one exception I mentioned at the end of episode 5 of the podcast. So the caldera, once a shelter to the Sith, had failed to protect them from the vengeful hammer of Republic justice. Another topic worth mentioning, and one that expands on the concept of the Stygian Caldera, is the Lost Tribe of the Sith. The Lost Tribe refers to members of the Sith Empire who found themselves stranded on the remote planet of Kesh, located in wild space. It all started when the Sith dreadnought Omen was ambushed by the Jedi during the events of the Great Hyperspace War. The crew of Omen were tasked by Nagasado with mining lignin crystals. These crystals were used to power lightsabers and other weapons. The crew was comprised of several humans, one Houk, and also several members of the Sith species, the redskin kind. So, the Omen gets ambushed and crash lands on Kesh. The human captain of the Omen, whose name is Yaru Korsin, quickly takes control of the situation. The native Kashyyyk think these newcomers are gods, and as a result, they are easily subjugated. Korsin declares himself Grand Lord, and a new order is created on Kesh. You see, the planet Kesh has very little in the way of metals, and therefore the crew of the Omen was never able to repair their ship and leave the planet. They were effectively stranded for good, and they had to make the best of a bad situation. So what does Sith do? They conquer, and they subjugate. And that's exactly what happened here. The exploits of the Lost Tribe of the Sith were covered in a series of short stories by John Jackson Miller. They were later collected into an anthology and released on July 24, 2012. In a 10-year anniversary tribute, John Jackson Miller recently released his writing notes for the series on his website. The stories cover the period from 5000 BBY, when the Omen first crashes, to 2975 BBY, roughly a 2,000-year time span. The tribe is significant because it still exists during Luke Skywalker's time. In 43 ABY, that's after the Battle of Yavin, descendants of the tribe managed to finally escape Kesh and come into contact with Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order. Those events are covered in the Fate of the Jedi series of novels, if you're interested in checking them out. One other thing to be aware of is that the Lost Tribe eventually becomes a human-only tribe. Early on in their history, the human contingent of the Omen crew effectively wiped out the pure-blooded Sith. The humans were unable to mate with the Kashyyyk natives, but after several thousand years, Force-sensitive Kashyyyk would later be integrated into and accepted within the new Sith Order. One last thing worth mentioning is that John Jackson Miller also wrote a 5-issue comic series on the Lost Tribe of the Sith called Spiral. The series was drawn by Andrea Mutti and was released by Dark Horse Comics between August and December 2012. One thing that's particularly interesting about this story is that we learn that even older Force wielders had landed on Kesh nearly 2,000 years before the Lost Tribe. If you remember, in the first episode of my podcast, I told you that the Sith Empire was formed when 12 Dark Jedi exiles came across and conquered the Sith race. Well, one of those exiles, a Dark Jedi named Remulus Dreypa, later left the Stygian Caldera in order to attack the Republic. His starship was intercepted by the Jedi, and they eventually found themselves on Kesh. Here's a quote from Dreypa.
I helped found the Sith philosophy years ago, and even then my lessers were content to rule mongrels in exile, but not me. I left then, as I intend to do again now. I reject Kesh, just as I rejected the Stygian Caldera. The stars are my domain, and I will have them again.
While we won't be getting into the story of Spiral, it's interesting from an anthropological standpoint, in that the native Kashyyyk formed a bunch of creation myths around this initial incursion by Dreypa and the Jedi, which would have taken place around 6,900 BBY. So when the Omen crashes in 5,000 BBY, the Kashyyyk thought that the protectors and destroyers of their myths had returned, literally an episode of Ancient Aliens playing out in real time. So yes, if you're interested, read the collected stories and Spiral if you want to learn more about the Lost Tribe, Kesh, and Lord Dreypa. I'm not sure whether this is legitimate or just speculation, but I've heard it said that the Lost Tribe was created as a plausible way to reintroduce the Sith threat in an era that takes place after Return of the Jedi. But for those of you who are familiar with that era of Star Wars history and legends, you know that there was no lack of Sith threats, quote-unquote, in the years following the deaths of Palpatine and Vader. But I digress. The next topic I want to focus on requires us to venture into an era between the fall of the Sith Empire and the adventures of Nomi and Ulic 1,000 years later, in 4,000 BBY. We previously discussed Friedan NAD in episodes 6 and 8 of the podcast. He was the Sith Lord who subjugated the planet of Onderon. His ghost later meddled in the affairs of Ulic and Master Arca during the events of the Friedan NAD uprising. He supplied Satal and Alima Keto with Sith artifacts, and if you remember, he also led Exar Kun down his dark path before eventually being destroyed by Kun once and for all. What we never really talked about was how NAD learned about the Sith arts in the first place. Like I mentioned earlier, the Republic all but wiped out the Sith Empire from existence. As we know, Sato escaped to Yavin 4 with his Massassi warriors. So where does Friedan NAD come in? NAD was born sometime before the year 4400 BBY. As a Force sensitive, He eventually traveled to the Jedi planet Ashas to be trained in the ways of the Force. He came under the tutelage of Jedi Master Matta Tremayne, who was particularly skilled in the art of lightsaber combat. The Jedi Masters of Ashas agreed that NAD was something of a prodigy. He excelled at his studies, and he was quick to learn new Force techniques. When the time came to grant several apprentices the rank of Jedi Knight, NAD believed his own promotion was imminent. To his shock, however, he was passed over entirely. You see, the Jedi Masters did this deliberately as a test. They knew Friedan NAD was naturally gifted and wanted to teach him, I guess, the value of humility in a Jedi Knight. Well, it had the opposite effect. NAD was furious and could not comprehend how he had been passed over for knighthood. He confronted his master Matta Tremayne over the issue. At the time, she was practicing her lightsaber forms in the outskirts of Ashas. Despite his confrontation, she ignored him and continued to practice her forms. After a half hour of this, NAD could not take it anymore. He exploded with frustration. In response, his master brought her lightsaber to bear mere centimeters from his chest. Then she continued with her forms as if nothing had occurred. NAD is beyond tilted at this point, so he proceeds to storm away from his master. Then he hears his master's voice call after him. "Friedan." NAD turns back to face her. "Some things cannot be taught directly. Some things you must find in yourself. If we were to show it to you, to point to it and say, 'Look, here it is,' you would not understand it. Jedi must be willing to look into their own hearts and spirits. If you do not, well, let us just say that you will never become a true Jedi."
Friedan responds to her. "Master Tremayne, please, I do want to be a Jedi. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I just need you to point me in the right direction. If you'll just..."
"I cannot, Friedan."
"Why? Why won't you help me? I'm not asking you to hand everything to me. Just tell me what it is that's stopping me from becoming a Jedi Knight."
"I cannot." At this point, NAD gets angry.
"Secrets. You, all of you, hide behind these secrets. You don't want us to learn them. No, that would take away from your power, your place in the Force. I am a Jedi. It doesn't matter what you say. I don't need your permission. You say you cannot answer me, but isn't it you won't answer? You spin this web of babble about nothing, and you expect us to chase after it like fools. Well, I won't, and none of you can handle that. I will become the greatest Jedi who ever lived, with or without your help."
"Prove it to me."
"What? I don't..."
"I say that you are no Jedi. Prove to me that you are."
"You think you can scare me away, is that it?" "No, I know I am the stronger. You can't defeat me with your malignant will."
A fierce duel between master and student ensued. After several passes, NAD found an opening in Tremayne's defenses and swung his lightsaber down in a killing blow. At that moment, Tremayne looked into his eyes. NAD realized too late that the entire thing had been a test manufactured by his master to test his readiness. Before he could stop himself, his blade cut through Matta Tremayne, and she became one with the Force, leaving behind only her Jedi robes, like Obi-Wan in Episode 4. At first, NAD was filled with grief over what he had done. Over time, however, he came to believe that Tremayne had brought death on herself. He also came to believe that the Masters had engineered these tests specifically to drive him away from the Jedi Order. Filled with rage, he left Ashas and set off for the heart of the old Sith Empire. He craved revenge, and his ambitions shifted from being the greatest Jedi to the greatest Sith sorcerer who ever lived. I will say, I kind of sympathize with NAD. Stay with me here, I'm not a Sith Lord. But I mean, the Masters were pretty arrogant, and the lesson was a bit high-handed. That said, I think it did show that he was clearly not ready to become a Jedi Knight. It's just too bad that the results were so disastrous. So, NAD traveled to Sith space, and on the planet of Ashas Re, he comes across the original Sith holocron of King Adus. Adus was a king who ruled over the Sith species in 28,000 BBY. Yeah, you heard that right. Over 21,000 years before they were conquered by the 12 Dark Jedi exiles. You know, this is a prime example of just how rich the Legend's continuity was. Like, this thing extended thousands of years back into the past. Anyways, Adus united the Sith on Korriban and repelled an invasion from the Rakatan Infinite Empire. That's going to be a very important name in some of our future episodes. using stolen technology from the Rakata, he was able to expand the confines of his own empire. And if you don't know who the Rakata or the Rakatan Infinite Empire are, well, don't you worry, because we're going to be talking about them quite a bit when we get to the Knights of the Old Republic game. Okay, back to Friedan NAD. He finds the holocron and learns about Adas's exploits. Throughout his travels, he is unable to find any members of the original Sith species. As you recall, they were mostly wiped out by the Republic. So as he was about to give up his quest, he learned that the legendary Sith Lord Nagasado was forced into exile on Yavin 4. The sources are kind of unclear as to how he came across this information, but through whatever means he did. So NAD set a course for Yavin 4. There he was confronted by descendants of the original Massassi warriors that had traveled there with Sado 600 years or so earlier. They tried to attack him, but NAD had grown strong in his travels. He was able to repel their attacks with ease using the dark side of the Force. Deeming him worthy, they brought him to Yavin's great temple. There, he found Nagasado in suspended animation. When he roused Sado from his centuries-long slumber, the Dark Lord quickly realized that NAD had a lot of potential. Sado took Friedan NAD on as a Sith apprentice and taught him the ways of Sith sorcery. As it goes, NAD's training eventually hit a plateau. After all, there could only ever be one Dark Lord of the Sith. When NAD felt he had learned everything Sado had to offer, he compiled the sum of his knowledge into a holocron, and then he killed Sado and declared himself the new Dark Lord of the Sith. Again, the details are not very clear as to how he killed Sado. You can chalk it up to all those moments kind of being lost in time. There you have it. That's how Sado died, and also how NAD became a Sith. It's not covered in the Tales of the Jedi comics, but now we have the full story. From there, NAD began searching for his own world to conquer. He eventually made his way to Onderon. Using the knowledge he gained from King Adas's holocron, he deposed the planet's existing monarchs and declared himself king. He transformed Onderonian culture into one mired in Sith lore and magic. Even though his rule was oppressive and tyrannical, the Onderonian people widely accepted his teachings, and him as ruler. Eventually, rumors of this tyranny reached the Jedi Order. They sent a strike team to deal with the Sith Lord. After a pitched battle, Friedan NAD and his forces were defeated, and he was killed. But as we know, the story did not end there. He continued to exercise his dark influence through his descendants, such as King Amun and Amun's wife, Queen Aminoa. It was only after Exar Kun destroyed his ghost in the Dark Lords of the Sith story arc that Friedan NAD's tyranny came to a complete end. Our next topic helps us fill in the gaps between the Sith War and the Redemption story arcs. If you recall, the Sith War takes place in 3996 BBY, whereas Redemption takes place 10 years later. We're going to talk about this a bit further later on, but suffice it to say that this war had significant repercussions on the galaxy at large. In the years immediately following the Sith War, the Jedi Order initiated what came to be known as the Great Hunt. During the war, Exar Kun and his minions used the powers of Sith alchemy and dark side magic to create monstrosities such as the fearsome Terentatek. The Terentatek was a vicious beast that fed on Force-sensitive blood in particular. They resembled Rancors, but on a much smaller scale. They were about a quarter the size of a Rancor. And they had a number of spines growing on their back, as well as massive claws and tusks, which were highly venomous. I strongly encourage you to read the descriptions of this episode to see how they're spelled, and then go and do an online image search and see what they look like for yourselves. Truly the stuff of nightmares. It fell to the Jedi to eradicate all of these Sith monsters from the galaxy. In steps a Jedi Knight named Duron Qel-Droma. Any relation to Ulic and Kay, I wonder? Well, as it turns out, he's their cousin, and he grew up with them on Alderaan. After what Ulic did to the galaxy, Duron was eager to restore his family's name. As a result, he took an active role in the Great Hunt. He fought alongside his Jedi companions, a human woman with short blonde hair named Shaela Nuur, and a green Twi'lek man by the name of Guun Saresh. Together, this trio made a name for themselves during the Great Hunt and earned a reputation as the Jedi Order's greatest hunters. Well, as these things sometimes go, Duron and Shaela developed feelings for each other. The type of feelings that stretch the limits of the Jedi Code. I'm curious to know where this code was when Ulic and Nomi were making out in Tales of the Jedi, but, as you may have guessed, this lore was created after the prequels came out, so by then, we all knew that the Jedi Order forbid attachments. Anyway, their Twi'lek companion Saresh, being somewhat of a Jedi purist, greatly disapproved of this budding relationship between them. One interesting thing to know about Shaela Nuur is that she was trained by Master Ood Banar. He was the Jedi Master who kind of looked like a living tree. If you remember, he was the one on Ashas that eventually actually turned into a tree in order to protect Jedi relics from Exar Kun in episode 12 of the podcast. Master Ood had previously given Shaela Nuur a Solari crystal, a very rare lightsaber crystal that would only work for the purest light side users. This had the effect of turning her lightsaber blade orange. Okay, back to our story. In 3993 BBY, about 3 years after the Sith War, the Jedi Order called the Great Hunt to an end. Duron and his companions were summoned to the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine, which you all might remember from the Knights of the Old Republic game if you've played it, and they were given a secret mission straight from the Jedi High Council on Coruscant. This mission required them to travel to the Sith homeworld of Korriban and slay any remaining Sith monstrosities on that planet. Various members of the Dantooine Enclave had reservations about sending another Qel-Droma to a planet steeped in dark side energy, but there was little they could do in the face of the High Council's decision. The Jedi trio traveled to Korriban and landed at a settlement that had sprung up relatively close to the Valley of the Dark Lords. After spending about a week or so trying to gather information, Duron expressed concern to his friends that the planet was changing them for the worse. They had all resorted to unscrupulous means in order to find out more information on where these Sith monsters were on Korriban. For instance, Shaela and Duron were hanging out with shady customers, the true scum of the galaxy. Saresh had even taken it upon himself to try and seduce a Sith acolyte, which kind of makes it then hypocritical for him to come down on Shaela and Duron for their relationship when he's clearly stretching the code himself. But I guess it's easy to rationalize anything when the ends justify the means. In addition to these concerns, and perhaps even more concerning, Duron was also periodically assaulted by strange and traumatic visions of a great war to come. Spoiler alert, he was seeing images from the events of the Knights of the Old Republic video game. After one such vision, Shaela attempted to comfort him. One thing led to another, and the two found themselves locked in a kiss. Not surprisingly, it was at this moment that Saresh walked in on the two. He was disgusted by their actions, and he ultimately decided to leave them on Korriban. Here's the exchange that took place between them. Saresh walks in on them and he says, "This is a disgrace. I saw it coming and I tried to warn you both." Shaela turns to him and she says, "Why, you self-righteous, arrogant." At that point, Duron tries to calm her down. "It's okay, Shaela. Calm down."
"Jedi do not behave like this. We do not form attachments. We protect a way of life that we can never have. That is our sacrifice. There is no passion. There is serenity. Sound familiar?"
"We know the Jedi code, Saresh."
"Then why are you walking the path of the dark side?"
"What about you? You're out there seducing Sith to get information. What makes you think that you can judge me?"
"Do you think I enjoy this? I am carrying out the wishes of the Council. That is all. I am here to kill Terentatex. By any means necessary. I don't need you to—"
"Just stop. Everyone, stop. This is insane. What's happening to the three of us?"
"Look, I cannot trust you as long as this passion exists between you two. It goes against everything we've learned. I've seen too many Jedi fall prey to its trap. Just look at your cousin, Qel-Droma, and what happened to him. Just answer me this, one simple question. Can you control your passion?"
"If it means renouncing our love, then no, Gunhan Saresh, we can't."
"Then you put our mission in peril, and I cannot risk that. We must go our separate ways. Here, take this data card. It will get you into the Valley of the Sith Lords. There you will find your Terentatex. Should you decide to stay, that is. My advice? Get out now while you still can. May the Force be with you."
And with those words, Gunhan Saresh left the other two Jedi to their own devices. 3 days later, Saresh found himself in the lower levels of the Wookiee planet Kashyyyk, hunting a Sith monster through the primeval forests. Unfortunately for Saresh, the monster was too powerful to take alone. It quickly overwhelmed him and ended the Jedi's life. With the Fellowship broken, these Jedi could not beat the Terentatex alone. Back on Korriban, Duron and Shaela made their way into the Valley of the Dark Lords, intent on finishing their quest. It was there that they felt the death of their friend across the stars. Saddened by his death, but resolving to push on, they made their way into a remote cave. Before they got very far, a Terentatex attacked them both. Again, without the help of Saresh, they had difficulty with the beast. Before running off, it managed to deliver a mortal blow to Duron. In his last moments, Duron had a vision. Here's what he told Shaela. "It's all right, Shaela. It finally makes sense. There is no chaos. The Qel-Droma robe. Revan will use it. Leave me here, Shaela, and leave this place. You must leave me here. We did it, Shaela. The future. It's full of light. After exchanging a couple I love yous with each other, Duron died. Instead of heeding his words, Shaela tracked the Terentatek to a tomb dedicated to Nagasado. For those of you who have played the Old Republic MMORPG, this could very well be the exact same tomb that you visit when you play one of the Sith classes on Korriban. So Shaela was filled with rage as she entered, but she recalled the words of Master Ood Banar. He once told her to remember to always stay in the light, something that she had failed to do. As two Terentateks made their way towards her, the blade of her lightsaber began to flicker and die. Shaela could no longer claim the light side of the Force as her ally. In the end, she met the same fate as her lover Duron. The robe of Qel-Droma, that's an interesting little bit of lore, isn't it? And how about that name drop, Revan? Well, without spoiling too much, we'll come back to this in the Knights of the Old Republic. If you'd like to read about Duron and Shaela, check out Star Wars Tales Issue 23, put out by Dark Horse Comics in March 2005. Their story is called Shadows and Light, written by Joshua Ortega and featuring art by Dustin Weaver. Moving into our next topic, and maybe the most interesting bit of lore I came across, was the Dark Reaper. This was a Sith superweapon that was created by ancient Sith Lords during the events of the Great Hyperspace War. It was used again 1,000 years later in the Great Sith War, and then, if you can believe it, became relevant again in the Clone Wars thousands of years later. So the Dark Reaper was this giant cylindrical dome, almost shaped like one of those alien motherships you see in movies like Independence Day. Inside the Reaper was housed a device called the Force Harvester. The Harvester was capable of killing anything within range by draining its Force energy, and then focusing this energy into beams that dealt massive damage to any object. For you Dragon Ball fans out there, it literally acted as a spirit bomb machine. To top it off, the Reaper was also equipped with dark-side-powered turbo lasers. Now, some of you may be wondering why we didn't hear about this devastating weapon in the Tales comics. Well, that's because it was first introduced in the Clone Wars video game, which debuted in late 2002 after the Tales of the Jedi had ended. In that game, Jedi Master Mace Windu explains that the Reaper required tremendous amounts of energy to function. Hence we have the Force Harvester, a device capable of absorbing the energy needed to cause devastating effects. We don't really get a sense of how it works, but anyways, it's Star Wars, it's fiction, so it doesn't really matter at this point. We just kind of march on and, accept it for what it is, like hyperdrives. Okay, so now we know generally how this thing functions. Let's see how it was used. Not much information is provided in terms of its creation. My research has uncovered that it was created by the ancient Sith in an armory on the Sith planet of Thule around 5000 BBY. It was used against the Galactic Republic during that war, but we're not really given much more in terms of specifics. It's presumed that Sato took it with him when he fled the Republic because it was rediscovered over 1,000 years later by Exar Kun during excavations on Yavin 4. This is no surprise, as we have to remember that Exar Kun was a Jedi archaeologist before turning to the dark side. So of course, if anyone was going to recover it, it would be him, of all people, to unearth this weapon. The Dark Reaper was later used by the Krath to gain the upper hand in the Great Sith War. Now, this is kind of interesting because in later sources we're constantly being told just how devastating the Great Sith War was. As we know, the war took place over the course of a year or so, and yet it required nearly 3 decades for the galaxy to recover. Well, if the Dark Reaper was being used, then this may account for the level of devastation that we don't really see in the comics, since the comics were so focused on the individual struggles of Ulic and Nomi and Exar Kun. The Dark Reaper aided Ulic and the Sith fleet in capturing a large portion of space around the Empress Teta system. Later sources also tell us that the Dark Reaper claimed a great number of Jedi lives before it was finally destroyed. Ulic apparently unleashed the Reaper on the Republic staging planet of Raxus Prime, killing thousands. Now we finally begin to understand why Silvar was so disgusted with the man in Redemption. He literally carried out a genocide. So the Reaper's destruction came about when Ulic left the Krath and rejoined the Jedi near the end of the war. If you remember, in episode 12, he kills his brother Kay, feels remorseful, gets stripped of the Force by Nomi, and then he's kind of back on the Jedi side for a little while there. Well, it turns out he not only told the Jedi where to find Exar Kun, he also told them how to defeat the Dark Reaper. This quote-unquote final battle with the Reaper took place on the same world it was created, the planet Thule. Using the information provided by Ulic, a Jedi task force staged an attack on the Dark Reaper, and they were able to disable the weapon. Apparently, however, they were unable to destroy it. They settled for breaking the weapon apart. Afterwards, the Republic took great pains to hide the pieces of the Reaper on a number of different planets. The Force Harvester, which was arguably the most important component, was hidden on Raxus Prime. Why they didn't just put it in a sun, I don't know, but anyways, here we are. And that's not where the story ends. Let's flash forward nearly 4,000 years to the Clone Wars. During the events of the video game by the same name, Count Dooku and his hired mercenary Cydon Prax eventually located the Force Harvester on Raxus Prime. Not only did they locate the Harvester, they also managed to capture Anakin Skywalker. Dooku then used Cydon Prax to activate the Force Harvester on a moon of the Wookiee planet Kashyyyk in order to test its capabilities. In the process, an entire forest was destroyed. Skywalker and a smuggler named Barra Kazan barely escaped with their lives. After escaping, they contacted the Republic to warn them about Dooku's new weapon. Dooku, however, wasted no time. He tested the Harvester again on planets like Mon Calamari, Agamar, and Bakura. After scouring the galaxy, Dooku was able to find other pieces of the dismantled Reaper. Having gathered all of the pieces, Dooku traveled to Thule and reactivated the Dark Reaper in an ancient Sith city. In a desperate attempt to stop Dooku, Anakin traveled to Ren Var. Does that name sound familiar? That's the planet we talked about in our last episode of the podcast. It's the frozen wasteland where Ulic went to die. So Anakin made this pilgrimage to the tomb of none other than Ulic Qel-Droma. There he confronted the Force Ghost of Qel-Droma. Here's a bit of what transpired.
Ulic Qel-Droma, I'm Anakin Skywalker. You defeated the Dark Reaper during the Sith War. Show me how to stop it again.
Yes, I can teach you to harness the power of the Force around you, making you immune to the Dark Reaper's effects for a short time. But heed me, this knowledge comes at great risk.
After gaining this knowledge from Qel-Droma's ghost, Skywalker led an attack on Thule to destroy the Dark Reaper. Although his master Obi-Wan Kenobi told him to wait for backup, "Wait for backup, Anakin!" Anakin ignored this and used a TX-130 fighter tank along with the knowledge he gained from Ulic to destroy the Sith superweapon once and for all. As an interesting postscript to this story, we learn that the knowledge gained from Ulic caused Anakin to act more arrogantly towards Obi-Wan, and it was generally seen as indirectly leading him to take another step towards the dark side of the Force. This was the great risk that Ulic spoke of. Anakin Skywalker, who was as impulsive as ever, ignored these risks. Despite foiling Dooku's plot with the destruction of the superweapon, the Clone Wars would continue to rage on for a couple more years until it ended with the rise of the Empire and Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader. The last thing I want to talk about today is what happens on a high level between the Tales of the Jedi and Knights of the Old Republic. The primary source for this exploration is the New Essential Chronology sourcebook written by Daniel Wallace and Kevin J. Anderson and published in 2005. In episode 12 of the podcast, near the end of the Great Sith War, we saw that the planet Ashas was devastated by the arrival of a supernova shockwave from the Kron cluster. With Ashas ruined, the Jedi Order relocated its headquarters to an existing temple on Coruscant, the galactic capital. The structure, which already sat on the site of a force wellspring, was expanded to accommodate more Jedi Knights. Also around this time, the Jedi increased their ties to the office of the Supreme Chancellor. These actions would have ramifications thousands of years later during the prequel trilogy. The chronology also tells us that any surviving Sith forces retreated to the territory that had historically been considered Sith space in the Outer Rim, so planets like Korriban and Thule. I guess it makes sense then that Guun Saresh would find a Sith acolyte to seduce on Korriban because this is where they went to after the war. We're also told that after the events of Redemption, Vima Sunrider learned much and eventually followed in her mother's footsteps to become one of the greatest Jedi of her age. The galaxy, however, did not remain at peace for long. Even though Mandalore the Indomitable met his end on the jungle moon of Duxan, as we saw in episode 12 of the podcast, a new soldier picked up his mask and declared himself Mandalore. This new Mandalore would be known as Mandalore the Ultimate. Okay, history lesson incoming. I know I've thrown a lot of dates at you so far, but I'm going to need you to whip out your datapad and follow along with me, because I'm going to throw a few more dates at you that'll help explain things. The years between 3995 BBY to 3966 BBY would later become known to galactic historians as the Restoration Period, so that's nearly 30 years. It was a period of relative peace where the Republic struggled to rebuild following the devastation caused by the Great Sith War in 3996 BBY. This will be relevant in later episodes when we talk about the significant changes in architecture and technology that occurred between Tales of the Jedi and Knights of the Old Republic. At the same time that the Republic was rebuilding, the Mandalorians were also rebuilding, and no one was paying attention to them. They were slowly preparing for their revenge against the Republic. If you remember, they were on the losing side of the Great Sith War, having allied themselves with Ulic and Exar. In a previous episode, I mentioned that the Tong, they were the original species of the Mandalorians, so with many of them having now died off, and especially decimated during that war, Mandalore the Ultimate carried out aggressive recruitment efforts to rebuild the greatly diminished Mandalorian ranks. These recruiting tactics welcomed members of all alien descent into the Mandalorian culture. So it was that the word Mandalorian stopped referring to a species and started referring to a people with a shared creed, a genuine movement. Mandalore formed a new group of commandos called the Neo-Crusaders. With his Crusaders, the Mandalorians began to conquer fringe worlds left defenseless in the Sith War's aftermath. Man, that word sounds so good to say, Mandalorian. I've always loved it. And I'm going to say it a few more times before I'm done today. So we're told that the Republic's effort to halt Mandalore's expansionism were half-hearted until the Warlord took advantage of their complacency and directly invaded Republic space. Wikipedia indicates that the early Mandalorian raids took place in 3976 BBY, so nearly 20 years into the Restoration period. The main conflict with the Republic did not occur until 3964 BBY at the Battle of Vanquo, although the Knights of the Old Republic campaign guide says that the Mandalorian War started in 3965 BBY. I mean, it's the difference of a year, so it probably doesn't really make a difference either way, but I just wanted you to know that there's a bit of a discrepancy in terms of the date. It's ancient history, right? So we might be off by a year here or there, it doesn't really matter. But this is where we'll pick up next time. 3964 BBY, approximately 32 years after the Great Sith War with Ulic and Exar ended, and approximately 22 years after Ulic died in Redemption. Okay, that was a lot of numbers to throw at you, but really the most important thing to keep in mind is that after 30 or so years of peace, the Mandalorians have re-emerged as a threat to the Republic's continued existence. My friends, we've now reached the end of the story for today. We've filled in some gaps and we've paved the way for what comes next. In our next episode, and with any luck, we'll be covering roughly half of the story arcs in the Knights of the Old Republic comic. This comic series preceded the first game and also introduces some of the characters that we'll later see in KOTOR 1. But while we wait, consider following me on Instagram for more frequent updates and Old Republic lore, all the lore you can handle. Until next time, keep your lightsaber on you, and in the words of Luke Skywalker, may the Force be with you.